Hello muscle car pro touring fans, welcome back to another tutorial. This time we're going to be talking about the first gen Camaro torque arm installation, so stay with us. Today we're working on a first gen Camaro installing our torque arm system. The torque arm is a fantastic performance advancement for the rear of your first gen Camaro. And we also have applicability for other models as well. Any questions? Give us a call. First thing you're going to do is you're going to remove your old parts. You need to take out the rear axle, your exhaust, disconnect your brake line, e-brake. You'll probably want to take the gas tank out to make doing this installation easier. You can work around the gas tank, but since we're going to be welding, grinding, doing some other things, I suggest that you take the gas tank out. You may even want to upgrade your gas tank to a gas tank with notched corners so that your exhaust can more easily fit around the new axle and gas tank. Having a look at the frame rails, we've taken off of the bump stops. It appears this car may have had some work done to it in the past, whether it was a floor pan or frame rails, it's hard to say, but it has had some work done. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and install the reinforcement brackets, but before we do, we're going to go ahead and just give them a coat of weld-through primer on the mating surface side. From there, on the torque arm upper cross member itself, you'll want to clean off powder coating to make sure that you can get a good weld between the torque arm cross member and the reinforcement bracket that'll be welded to the frame rail. Clean off as much as you feel that you need to make your weld. You can trace around the reinforcement bracket to find the appropriate location to clean the paint off of the frame rails. You'll have to clean the paint off of the frame rails to get a good weld. Once the area is marked, you can just use a disc sander and go ahead and clean those areas. And before installing the reinforcement plate, you may want to also put a coat of weld-through primer in this area as well. We'll do the same on both sides as we prep the chassis for the installation of the reinforcement brackets. This is what that area looks like now that it's all cleaned up before we install the reinforcement plate. On this car, we're not doing any mini tubs on this installation. So if you are going to do mini tubs and if you want to maximize your tire width and wheel width in the rear, you may have other modifications that you're doing to the frame rails, and that's perfectly fine. If you are sure to look in the instructions, you'll find a dimension in there to help you get the reinforcement plate lined up on the frame rail. Also has a hole in the same location as the threaded bung in the frame rail where the axle bump stop used to be mounted. So we'll use some vice clamps to hold the piece in place. If you're familiar with fabrication at all, you know that you'll just want to get it held in place, and a little bit of hammer work will help everything get seated flat before you start to apply the welds. And as you go through welding, if the part shifts or lifts anywhere, you can always knock it back down with your hammer. So we'll get everything in place. We'll tack it up, double check everything, and then we'll go for a full weld in. Weld around all the edges as much as you can. You won't be able to get the top inner edge, the top edge on the inside of the frame rail because the trunk floor pan is going to be in the way of getting your torch up there. But do your best to get the part completely welded. And this is what you should have more or less when you're done welding your reinforcement plate to the existing frame rail. Again, if you're mini tubbing the car, you may have to modify this plate. If you're cutting into the frame rail to maximize the width of wheel and tire that you can run on the car, you can make the cut the same on this reinforcement plate. Scuff it up and give it a shot of weld through primer, because there will be areas that you're not able to access after you make the weld with the crossmember. When installing the crossmember, you're going to want to fit the crossmember centered between the frame rails, and it's going to be pushed back until the top of those square pads mounted on the crossmember touch the trunk floor pan. There may be a bigger gap at the bottom than there is at the top. If the top is touching, you may have 3/8 of an inch more or less at the bottom of that pad. Or if the car's never been modified, it may fit up flush top and bottom. But what we have found is cars that have had the trunk floor replaced, the trunk pan has a little bit different shape. And so we do have a backup plate. And if between the backup plate and the plate welded to the crossmember, you still have a gap, you can take up that gap with some washers. So we'll come to that part later, mounting those bolt holes. But once it's centered in the car and you're happy with it, its position, which you can double check with measurements found in the instructions, you can go ahead and weld the crossmember in. Once the crossmember is in, you can go ahead and refinish this area with your preferred aerosol paint or something more advanced, whatever you like there, whatever your preference is there. Now that we have the upper crossmember in place, we're going to go ahead and drill those holes in the floor pan that align with the 4 holes on each side of that pad mounted, welded to the top of the crossmember. Here you can see what I described earlier. There's a little bit of a gap between that pad, that rectangle pad on the crossmember, and the trunk floor pan of the car. And we have a secondary smaller pad that I would place against the floor of the car. And if there's a gap still in there, we can fill that gap with 1 or 2 washers to take up that space before we drill the holes and torque everything down. Now, because the car is already up in the air, we're going to go ahead and install the torque arm front crossmember, which goes across the 2 rear bolts of the subframe. Whether you're running a stock subframe or an aftermarket subframe, you'll want to take out the rubber mounts and install our billet aluminum mount for the back of the subframe, which has a shorter height than a standard body mount to accommodate the crossmember, which mounts on top of that mount and gets sandwiched between the floor and the body mount. With that installed, we're going to go ahead and let the car down, and we're going to install those 4 bolts on each side for the pad that we looked at underneath the car that's welded to the crossmember. We have the reinforcement plates that go inside the trunk, and you can just drop the bolts down from the top from inside the trunk. You'll need a friend to help you do this unless you have really long arms. And once those bolts are dropped through, you can install the nylocks and torque those up. Here you can see that the welded plate on the crossmember and the smaller plate is against the trunk floor. There was a small gap on this car that was filled in between those 2 plates using a couple of washers, and the bolt has been installed and the nylock has been torqued down. I'm not going to take you guys through building up your axle. I'm going to leave that to the axle manufacturer. Follow their instructions for building up your axle and housing. Our preference is to run a Ford 9-inch style housing and third member. However, if you are running a 10 or 12-inch GM rear end, we do have a a pinion mount for that application, and you can find details around that in the instructions. For the 9-inch, you'll have to take out your pinion bolts and use our provided longer bolts when installing the pinion mount on the rear axle. We have two different pinion mounts, one for standard forward clocking of that bolt pattern, and then there's a second one which corresponds with Mosier rear ends, which are slightly rotated. We're going to take the speed nuts off of the body where the spring pockets were mounted, and we're just going to tidy up those holes a little bit, make sure that they're flat so that we can move the bracket around if we need to. And we're going to use a die grinder just to open up the holes a little bit to give us a little bit of adjustment on installing the Articulinks. The main thing here is we don't want to have any side load when we go to put the Articulinks into the rear end. Preparing the chassis in this way will help make life a little bit easier later. Now we can prepare the Articulinks. There's dimensions in the instructions, so you know how long to make the Articulinks. And you adjust the length of the Articulinks just by turning it clockwise or counterclockwise. It's a threaded male and female, so and it's a right-hand thread. So turning it clockwise will make it shorter. Turning it counterclockwise will make it longer. Once you're happy with the length of your Articulinks to the instructions, then we can go ahead and install the spring pocket on the female end of the Articulink. Make sure that the grease zerk is pointing away from the spring pocket so it's accessible once the system is completely assembled. It's not necessary to grease these grease fittings. It's kind of a throwback to the guys who were used to seeing grease fittings all over the underside of these cars. All the bushings are Delrin and they don't require lubrication, and you should never have any creaking or squeaking from them. However, if you would prefer to, you can go ahead and lubricate these points, and you can use any lubricant that you typically use on a chassis. Assemble the Articulink to the spring pocket using the bushing, spacer in the correct location, and torque these down to final torque. It's not like a rubber bushing that needs to be torqued at ride height. The stainless steel spacer that goes through the Articulink will accept the crush and still allow the Articulink to move smoothly and freely around the spring pocket. So yeah, go ahead and tighten those up. Final torque on those, because you can't access the nut and bolt once it's installed in the car. With this Articulink attached to the spring pocket, you can go ahead and install the spring pockets in the car. Again, you will not want to fully torque these three fasteners. You'll leave them loose so that you have some adjustment while finishing the rest of the install setup. And now we'll look at hanging the coilovers in the chassis. So these are the mounting points for the coilovers, and it's probably best or easiest for you to go ahead and hang the coilover in that new Crossmember that we installed in the car before going further. If you wait until later to install the coilover or do your final torque on the coilover, you're probably going to find that the space is limited and you're not able to move it where you'd like it, or you'll have to work around the rear end or something else. So we generally will hang the coilovers before bringing the rear end over to the car, and you can do a final torque on those upper bolts. It's a spherical joint, and it'll move freely once it's fully torqued. You will have to install the ends on the shock. So with your rear end fully assembled, we can move it over to the car. You could assemble the rear end in the car if you have a timing issue, logistics issue with getting all of the parts for your rear end. But our preference is to just go ahead and fully build that rear end on the bench and then move it over to the car. So here we are hanging the coilovers and getting those fully torqued up before bringing the rear end to the car. Then we'll bring the rear end over and we will raise it up until we can get the Articulink bolts through. And that'll help stabilize it. Then we'll raise it up that last little bit to get the coilovers on there. Now, before you take your support away from the rear end, we're going to install a strap. That strap is going to wrap around the top of the rear end and anchor to the coilover and Articulink bracket on the rear end. And we can put the other end of the strap to the chassis somewhere solid. And what that's going to do is it's going to stop that rear end from falling forward or rotating forward as we take the jack away from the rear end. And this will be important for installing the torque arm. Otherwise, the pinion mount will be so low you won't be able to get the torque arm installed without a lot of hassle. Put the drive shaft in before you install the torque arm, or you'll be taking the torque arm back out to install the drive shaft. Once the drive shaft is installed, we can go ahead and install the torque arm by inserting the pin into the Crossmember torque arm receiver. Then we can push the bolt through the pivot at the rear end. Then we'll check our pinion mount and how the pinion mount lines up with the holes in the torque arm where they mate together. If it's off to one side or the other, you can move the shims at the pinion mount to the left or to the right to get the perfect alignment for the pinion mount bolts to line up and go through. So here you can see we're going to install the dog bone or the bow tie. Our bolt holes are lined up now after shifting a couple of the shims from one side to the other. It's very, very close, so just give it a little shake here and it'll line right up and those bolts can be spun in by hand. Now we're going to put the panhard bar together. They're left-handed threads on one side, right-handed threads on the other. The panhard bar is aluminum and the spherical joints are steel, so you're going to want to use some copper slip or anti-seize of some kind. And we're just roughing it in right now, so don't worry about tightening everything. And you can see like all of our nylocks are loose. They're just spun on by hand. And that's because we might have to make some changes to the setup as we start to take measurements and check things out as we rough it in. But we know the axle is installed for the last time, so you can do your brake lines. If you want to do your e-brake cables and that stuff, you could do that now as well. But the brake line is probably a good one to do, otherwise it's probably just going to sit there and drip on you. So we will go for the first wheel installation, and we may have to take these off again. This is just sort of roughing in our setup. But we're going to get the car down on its own weight, and we're going to check the ride height to see that we're happy with that. If we're not, we have threaded coilovers that we can check spring height and change the ride height of the car. And we also have several different mounting positions on the rear axle bracket. First appearances, this is not terrible. However, we are going to adjust the panhard bar a little bit just to get the axle centered over the car. And you can see the you can see the chassis move relative to the wheel as he turns that panhard bar. Now we'll take some measurements. There's several different ways to do this, and there is some guidance in our instructions. If you're not familiar with this process, you may look for a body shop reference material or a body shop to help you square that front subframe and axle. So we'll check the ride height side to side and all the way around the car just to see that we're happy with the ride height. You can expect the springs to settle in a little bit. You might get a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch of springs settling in over time. If we're happy with the front subframe being square in the car, then we can go ahead and run those bolts down. We're going to let the car down again and check the ride height. Now, you may find over time that the springs will seat in a little bit, or they will come down a little bit from their installation height after they sit with weight on them for a few months or a few weeks. So if you probably want to set your car up maybe a 1/2 inch high and let the car settle back down into its final position. Or later, you'll just have to raise the back of the car up after those springs settle in a little bit. If you don't have a scale, don't worry about it. We happen to have the luxury of having scales, and we want to try and scale the car and get the car decent for competition and for driving. We're going to take lots of measurements, and we're going to make minor adjustments, and we're going to take lots of measurements again, and we're going to check and recheck, and after everything that we do, we're going to recheck again. And there's a lot of different measurements and places where we can do this, and some of that will be detailed in the instructions. And there's another method that you can see here where we'll use a bar against the wheel and tire, and we'll measure to the pinch weld or rocker panel. And what we're checking here is to make sure that there's no thrust angle in the car. We don't want that rear axle to have any thrust angle and give the car a funny driving characteristic. So in this case, there was a small bit of thrust angle that was detected in the measurements, and there's probably enough room from hogging out the holes around the Articulink or spring pocket mount and other things. We're just gonna use that strap again, that 1-inch strap, and we're just gonna try and pull one side of the axle. It only needs to go like a 1/16 of an inch. So in this case, we were able to use that strap and just make a small adjustment in the position of the rear axle and get it straightened out in the car and eliminate that thrust angle that we had seen in our measurements. Once we do that, we'll go back under the car and we'll check all the measurements again. And if you're struggling with your measurements and it's not perfectly perfect, to the 64th or 32nd, a lot of these cars are old. They've been crashed or they've had corrosion repair, collision repair, different things. You may have to average some of your measurements, and you may have to make a judgment call. But there are resources available for installing a subframe and installing the rear end. Check your measurements, do your best, get it squared up, and that'll give you the best chance going forward. Once you're happy with that, we'll tighten up the front spring pockets, or what used to be the front spring pocket and now holds the Articulink. After those are tightened up, we're going to just check that there's no side load. So the bolt should come out fairly easily, and the Articulink should swing down from the rear axle with no popping or springing or side load. There should be no boing. It should drop in and out of that bracket very smoothly with no side load. Tighten up the other spring pocket, and we'll check the rear bolt at the axle on this one too, and just make sure that there's no side load. Now in this case we weren't able to achieve no side load, so we had to take the spring pocket down and just cut the nub off the front of it to get a little bit more adjustment. But basically that little bit of die grinding that we did gave us enough movement to get to where the Articulink was happy in there. It was just that little nub on the front of the spring pocket that needed to be cut off to give us the full movement that we needed. So now we can go back on these and do final torque and final installation. And we're going to come down and check everything again, make sure that we like the ride height, make sure that we like the axle center in the car, make sure that we like all of the cross measurements, all of the subframe measurements, recheck the thrust angle, and make sure that we're happy with everything there. Now we can go ahead and install the two additional bolts at the back of the spring pocket. To do this, you'll have to drop the rear of the Articulink down, swing it out of the way so you can get your drill in there, and you're going to put a hole through the top of the through the spring pocket, through the floor, and we can add two additional bolts to the spring pocket just to give the spring pocket to the chassis a little bit more grip. And if there's a gap between the spring pocket and the floor of the car, that gap can be filled with a washer. And we'll do the same thing on both sides. We'll tighten those up. So in this case, the bolts do have to go in from the bottom because you wouldn't want a bolt that was a little bit long to, you wouldn't want to risk having that hit the Articulink. So put the bolts through from the bottom when you put those two additional bolts in. Okay, now that we're positive that we have no side load on the Articulinks and the spring pockets are locked down to final torque, go ahead and torque up the rest of the bolts. Your coilovers, lower bolt, your Articulink bolts, your dog bone bolts or pinion mount bolts. Go ahead and do a final torque on all of the fixings under the car. Check everything. Now you're ready to install your gas tank. If you got a new gas tank with notched corners, you can go ahead and install that. Install your exhaust, make the car roadworthy, and do a road test. And when you get back from your first road test, go around and check all the hardware again. Check that your panhard bar is level with the axle, parallel with the axle. And after 500 miles, you probably just go back under and check everything again. But you're ready to rock and roll. Hope you enjoy your system, and if you have any questions, just let us know. We're happy to help, and that's what we're here for. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for checking in and checking this installation video. Also, please use this in conjunction with the instructions. I may not have covered every single detail, and that wasn't the purpose. This video is really meant to supplement the written instructions, which will have details on bolts, bolt sizes, thread pitches, torque values, where to use Loctite, where to use Kappa slip or something else. So use this in conjunction with your instructions, and if you have any problems, give us a call. Thank you.